When Daniel showed up at my doorstep 6 years ago, he was just a skinny kid with a busted lip and a garbage bag slung over his shoulder. I remember opening the door and seeing his big brown eyes darting everywhere, but at me like he was ready to bolt if I made the wrong move. He was 14, scared out of his mind, and he needed somewhere to crash. I'd signed up for this foster thing thinking I'd get younger kids, Maybe a 6-year-old who'd think my terrible pancake art was cool. But instead, I got Daniel, who barely said 2 words to me that first week and spent most of his time hiding out in his room. It took months for him to warm up, and even then, it wasn't much. He'd help me carry groceries and or fix something around the house without being asked, but he kept this wall up, like he didn't want to owe anyone anything. I didn't push. I figured he'd talk when he was ready. And eventually he did. We'd be sitting at the kitchen table, me grading papers, I'm a teacher, by the way, and him fiddling with his phone. He'd drop little pieces of his story, like breadcrumbs. His mom had left when he was a baby. His dad, well, let's just say his dad wasn't exactly Father of the Year. By the time he ended up with me, Daniel had been through more homes than he could count. I don't know when it changed exactly. Maybe it was the way he'd look up from the couch during movie nights, giving me this half smile like he was finally starting to trust me. Or maybe it was the time he got sick, and I stayed up all night making him soup and checking his fever, and he muttered a quiet "thanks, Emma," before drifting off. But somewhere along the way, he stopped being just the kid I was fostering and became family. When he turned 18, I was terrified he'd leave and I'd never hear from him again. But he didn't. He stuck around, helping out with the bills and taking night classes at the community college. We fell into this rhythm, this comfortable routine that felt good, like home. Then he turned 20 and everything changed. I don't know if it was sudden or if I'd just been blind to it, but one day I looked at him and he wasn't a kid anymore. He was taller, broader, with this quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. It hit me like a ton of bricks. He wasn't the scared 14-year-old I'd taken in. He was a grown man. And he was looking at me differently too. Lingering glances, little touches that felt like they meant something more. At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just being stupid. I mean, I'm 45, he's 20. It's ridiculous, right? But then there was that night. We were sitting on the porch, the sun setting behind the hills. It had been a long day, and I was nursing a glass of wine while he sipped on a soda. We weren't talking much, just enjoying the quiet. And then he said, out of nowhere, Emma, you're the best thing that ever happened to me. I laughed, trying to play it off. Oh, stop. You're just saying that because I make good lasagna. But he didn't laugh. He just looked at me, serious as I'd ever seen him. No, I mean it. You saved me. I don't think I'd still be here if it wasn't for you. I didn't know what to say. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he'd hear it. And then he reached over and took my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. It was such a small gesture, but it felt electric. After that, everything was different. I started noticing the way he'd look at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, or how he'd find excuses to be close to me. And I couldn't deny it anymore. I felt it too. I'd lie awake at night, torn between what I felt and what I thought was right. We talked about it eventually because we had to. I told him it was complicated, that people would judge, that it didn't make sense. But he just looked at me with those steady brown eyes and said, I don't care what anyone thinks. I love you, Emma. One evening, after a long day at work, I decided to take a shower to relax. The day had been relentless, back-to-back meetings, deadlines looming like storm clouds. and the constant buzz of emails demanding my attention. By the time I got home, I felt drained, both mentally and physically. The idea of a warm shower was the only solace I could cling to, a small promise of peace at the end of an otherwise chaotic day. The bathroom was a sanctuary. As I turned on the faucet, the sound of rushing water filled the small space, drowning out the noise of the world outside. Steam began to rise, curling around me like a comforting embrace. I stripped off my clothes, leaving behind the weight of the day along with the fabric. When I stepped under the spray, the warmth enveloped me, and I closed my eyes, letting the water cascade over my skin. It was a simple pleasure, but in that moment, it felt like salvation. With my eyes shut, I allowed my thoughts to wander. My mind, however, was a tangled mess. Images of Daniel kept creeping in, unbidden but persistent. His smile, the way his eyes seemed to hold a secret only I could unlock, the subtle brush of his hand against mine when we passed each other, all of it haunted me. It was maddening. For years, I had buried my feelings for him, convincing myself that what we had was strictly friendship. But the truth had a way of bubbling to the surface, much like the steam around me. Just as I was beginning to lose myself in those thoughts, a sound jolted me back to reality. The creak of the bathroom door. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. Who could it be? I'd locked the front door, hadn't I? Panic flared briefly, but then I heard a voice. His voice. Emma. Daniel's tone was tentative, almost hesitant, but there was a firmness underneath, as if he had made a decision and wasn't going to back down. My breath hitched. Daniel, what are you doing? I managed, though my voice was barely above a whisper. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. There was a pause, the kind that stretched on endlessly, and then I heard his footsteps. He was coming closer. I couldn't stop thinking about you. About us, he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his words. I don't want to pretend anymore. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, fear, hope, and something deeper, something I had tried so hard to ignore. And then, before I could process what was happening, he stepped into the shower. The space was suddenly smaller, the air thicker with steam and unspoken tension. Water dripped from his hair, trailing down his face, and his gaze locked onto mine. The heat of the water seemed to pale in comparison to the intensity of his presence. For a moment, we just stood there, neither of us daring to break the fragile silence. My chest ached with the weight of everything I wanted to say but couldn't find the words for. Daniel was the first to move. Slowly, carefully, he reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he brushed a strand of wet hair from my face. The gesture was so tender, so deliberate, that it sent a shiver down my spine despite the warmth surrounding us. You don't have to say anything, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the water. Just tell me if this feels wrong. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. How could I explain that nothing about this felt wrong? That it felt like everything I had been yearning for, but was too afraid to admit. Instead, I let my actions speak for me. I stepped closer, closing the gap between us, and placed my hand gently against his chest. I could feel his heartbeat, strong and steady, grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. He leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate, giving me every opportunity to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. When our lips finally met, it was like a dam breaking. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, as if we were testing the waters. But then it deepened, years of unspoken feelings pouring into that single moment. It was a release, a confession, and a promise all at once. The world outside ceased to exist. The only thing that mattered was him, his touch, his warmth, the way he held me like I was something precious. The water continued to flow, a gentle backdrop to the storm of emotions raging between us. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him closer, needing to feel every inch of him against me. It wasn't just about the physical connection. It was about finally letting ourselves feel what we'd been denying for so long. As we stood there, tangled together under the stream of water, a sense of clarity washed over me. I wasn't afraid anymore. I had spent so much time running from my feelings, convincing myself that it was safer to keep them locked away. But now, with Daniel's arms around me and his lips pressed against mine, I realized how foolish I had been. This wasn't something to fear, it was something to cherish. Eventually, we broke apart, our foreheads resting against each other as we caught our breath. His eyes searched mine, as if looking for confirmation that this was real, that it was okay. I gave him a small nod, a smile playing at my lips. "Whatever comes next," I whispered, "we'll face it together." His answering smile was brighter than anything I had ever seen. And in that moment, I knew this was just the beginning. The sun had barely risen that day, casting soft streaks of light across the empty spaces of our home. I woke up to the quiet stillness, the kind that lingers when everything you've known feels hollow. I reached for the spot beside me in bed, expecting to find the familiar weight of Daniel's presence. But it was cold, an empty void where his warmth had once been. Panic surged up inside me like a tidal wave, and I sat up, heart pounding in my chest, hoping that maybe I had just imagined it. But no, his side of the bed remained untouched. The pillow, still perfectly fluffed, didn't bear the indentation of his head. I glanced at the clock. It was already past noon. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I had overslept or missed a call. Something, anything that would explain this sudden, overwhelming silence. I shuffled into the living room, half expecting him to be there, sprawled on the couch in one of his old hoodies, that lazy smile spreading across his face as if he had been waiting for me to find him. But the room was empty. The coffee table still held the mugs from last night, the ones we'd shared, laughing about something silly I can't even remember now. I tried to shake off the unease that was slowly crawling through me. I called his phone again, straight to voicemail. I left a message, my voice trembling, unsure of what to say. "Hey, it's me. Just checking in. Call me when you get this." But even as I said the words, I knew, deep down, that this wasn't just some temporary disappearance. Something had shifted. I made myself lunch, or at least I tried to. My hands shook too much to chop anything properly, so I ended up making a sandwich I didn't really want. The house, once so alive with his presence, now felt cavernous. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, made my heart leap into my throat. I wanted to believe it wasn't what I feared, that this was some misunderstanding, some silly mistake. But the sinking feeling in my stomach refused to go away. The hours passed in slow motion. Time seemed to stretch, each minute dragging on longer than the last. I told myself that he'd come back soon, that this was just a blip, a brief absence. But as the afternoon turned into evening, and then night, that hope began to slip away. I spent hours pacing the house, my mind running in circles. I tried texting him again, sending him a simple message. "Please talk to me. Where are you?" But my phone remained silent, and with each passing minute, my anxiety twisted tighter, choking out any semblance of reason. I tried not to cry. I told myself it wasn't the end, that he was probably just thinking things through. But the thought of him out there, without me, was like a weight pressing on my chest. Every minute that ticked by made it harder to breathe. By the time night fell, I was a wreck. The bed felt like an ocean, too vast and too cold. I buried my face in the pillow, hoping to smell his scent, but it was gone, replaced only by the faint scent of clean sheets. I reached for the space where he'd slept, wishing, longing for him to be there. The emptiness was unbearable. I couldn't keep the tears from falling anymore. They blurred my vision, staining the pillowcase. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my shirt and curled up into a ball, as if somehow, by closing myself off from the world, I could block out the gnawing ache in my heart. But it didn't work. The silence screamed at me. The house, once our shared sanctuary, now felt like a prison. I closed my eyes, trying to think back to the last time things felt right. It wasn't even that long ago, just a few days. We'd been laughing in the kitchen, sharing stupid stories, making plans for the weekend. I had seen the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his dreams for the future. His excitement was contagious, and I had felt so sure that we were on the same page. But now, in the echoing silence, all of that felt like a distant memory. What had changed? What had I missed? Maybe it wasn't something he had done. Maybe it was something I had done. Maybe I had pushed him too hard, or said the wrong thing at the wrong time. Maybe I had been too needy, too demanding. What if he hadn't been ready for this? For us? Maybe I had forced him into something he wasn't prepared for, and now he was gone because of it. The doubt wormed its way into my thoughts, poisoning everything. I tried to remember the good times, the laughter, the quiet moments we shared. But all I could see now was the emptiness where he had been. The gnawing ache in my chest intensified. I missed him so much that it hurt, in a way I didn't even know how to describe. It was a physical pain, the kind that made me question if I could ever breathe again without him beside me. I wanted to scream, to shake some kind of sense into him, to demand answers. But all I could do was sit in the quiet, waiting for a sign, any sign that he was still there, still coming back to me. But there was nothing, and I realized as the hours dragged on and the night deepened that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't coming back at all. The evening had unfolded in a haze, the colors of the sky slowly fading into darkness. I had been curled up on the couch, the weight of the past few days pressing down on me like an invisible force. I had given up on expecting anything. The house felt too quiet now, too empty without Daniel, and I had resigned myself to the aching void that had taken his place. But then it came, the knock. Soft, tentative, but unmistakable. My heart stuttered in my chest as I froze, unsure if I was imagining it. I couldn't bring myself to hope. Not again. Not after all the unanswered texts, the unanswered calls, the silence that had filled the space between us for what felt like an eternity. But I stood up anyway, my legs shaky, my breath shallow. The door seemed miles away as I made my way to it. I opened it slowly, half expecting to see some stranger, or perhaps no one at all. But then there he was, Daniel. His hair was messy, his shirt wrinkled, and in his hand, a bouquet of wildflowers, their petals still fresh, a strange contrast to the storm that had clearly raged within him. Daniel, I breathed, unable to keep the tremor from my voice. His eyes met mine, tired, but full of something I couldn't name at first. It was as though he had been running from something, from himself maybe, and had finally come to a stop. He stepped inside without a word, placing the bouquet on the table, his movements deliberate but unsure, like he was walking on fragile ground. "I'm sorry I left," he said, his voice thick, raw. The words hung in the air like an apology I had waited for, but didn't know if I was ready to hear. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself, but my chest tightened with emotion. I had been so sure that this was it, that he was gone, that whatever love we had would never be enough to pull him back. And yet, here he was, standing in front of me, breaking my heart all over again with his apology. I needed time to think. He continued, his gaze never leaving mine. About us, about everything. He paused, taking a breath, as if the next words were too heavy to say. And I realized I don't want to waste another second doubting what I feel. I love you, Emma. I want to spend my life with you. His confession hit me like a tidal wave. All the pain, all the fear, all the confusion. It all came rushing back to the surface. And before I could say anything, the tears started to fall. I couldn't stop them. I reached out, my hands trembling as I pulled him closer, my body desperate to feel the warmth of his embrace, to remind myself that this wasn't just a dream. He closed the distance between us in an instant, his hands gentle as they cupped my face, his thumbs brushing away the tears I hadn't even realized were falling. His lips met mine with a tenderness I had forgotten existed, as if he was holding back everything he had wanted to say in those days apart. His kiss was slow, deliberate, each movement speaking the words we hadn't said, the apologies we hadn't voiced. When he pulled back, I felt a sense of calm settle over me, but it was the kind of calm that comes after a storm. My forehead rested against his, and I clung to him like a lifeline. The silence between us was no longer uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, with promises that had yet to be spoken, but were already clear between us. I love you too, I whispered, my voice barely audible, breaking with emotion. I've loved you for so long, Daniel. His smile was soft, almost relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He didn't say anything, just held me tighter, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt the knot of uncertainty loosen in my chest. We didn't rush. We didn't need to. There was no urgency to our touch, no frantic energy. It was like the world outside had ceased to exist. We spent hours talking about everything, about nothing. About the past, about the future. About what had been broken and what was worth fixing. We kissed in between words, in between laughter, the kind of kisses that felt like they could go on forever and still leave us wanting more. Every touch, every word, every shared breath felt like it was binding us together in a way that was far deeper than before. Eventually, we moved to the bedroom, the room that had once felt like a hollow shell in his absence. It had been a space I had avoided, the emptiness between the sheets a constant reminder of the void he had left behind. But tonight, it felt different. It wasn't just a room anymore, it was our space, a place where we could breathe life back into the silence. As I walked across the threshold, Daniel's hand slipped into mine, the warmth of his skin grounding me, reminding me that I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't drifting through this sea of doubt anymore. I was anchored, here with him. We didn't rush. We didn't need to. It wasn't about the urgency of desire or the impatience of time. There were no expectations, no rush to fill the quiet with anything but the soft sounds of our breathing, the occasional laugh, and the quiet thrum of our hearts beating in sync. In that moment, we didn't need words. We didn't need to say anything. Everything was already said in the way our hands moved over each other, the way our bodies leaned in, a natural gravity pulling us closer, as if the very act of being near one another was enough. When his arms wrapped around me, it felt like home, like all the pieces of me that had been scattered during the days he was gone had finally found their place again. He pressed his forehead against mine, and I closed my eyes, breathing in the familiar scent of him, cologne mingling with the warmth of his skin, like something I had known for a lifetime. His lips brushed mine once, softly, like a promise. Then again, a little deeper, a little slower, like a question that needed to be answered. I reached up, threading my fingers through his hair, feeling the way it was still damp from the shower, the subtle roughness of his jaw against my palm. The touch felt sacred, almost reverent, as if we were both rediscovering each other. He gently pulled the straps of my dress off my shoulders, the fabric falling away, and I felt vulnerable in a way that wasn't frightening. Vulnerable because I knew he wouldn't hurt me. He never had, not in the way that mattered. The weight of the world seemed to lift with each inch of fabric that fell to the floor, leaving me exposed, but not ashamed. He looked at me then, really looked at me, his eyes soft and searching, as though he was memorizing every curve, every inch of skin that he had missed, and I felt a wave of warmth rush through me. It wasn't just physical warmth, it was a deeper kind of warmth, the kind that comes from being truly seen, truly known. There were no walls between us now, no doubts, no reservations. Everything that had kept us apart in the past seemed so small, so insignificant, in the face of what we were now, together in this moment with nothing to hide. We didn't need to speak. It wasn't about the rush of words or the urgency of touch. It was the simple, perfect understanding that we were exactly where we were meant to be. I could feel his heart against mine, the rhythm steady like a shared heartbeat. And in that rhythm, in that stillness, was everything. It was the promise of the future, the unspoken understanding that whatever came next, whatever storms we would face it together. I could feel it in the way his hands roamed over my skin, his fingers tracing the outline of my shoulder, as if he was marking the spot where he had left his heart all those days ago. And as we lay there, pressed together, no longer searching for the words to explain how we got here, because the journey, however messy, had led us to this, the outside world seemed so distant. There was nothing but the quiet hum of our shared warmth, the soft weight of his body against mine, and the knowledge that in this room, in this space that had once been so lonely, we had found something unshakable. I felt safe, I felt whole. And as his hands tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, there were no doubts anymore. There was nothing left to fear. It was just us, here in this moment, knowing that whatever came next, we would face it side by side, without hesitation, without regret. Because in this moment, we had everything we needed. And that was enough. The next morning, the sunlight poured in through the windows, casting a warm, golden hue across the room. It felt as though the world had been reborn with the dawn. And as I stretched in the bed beside Daniel, I couldn't help but feel the shift inside me. The heaviness of the past few days seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a sense of belonging, as though we had finally found our place in the world. Daniel, always with that spark in his eyes, insisted on making breakfast. He wasn't much of a cook, but there was something incredibly endearing about the way he tried. His attempt at scrambled eggs was more like a scrambled mess, but it didn't matter. We laughed at his failed culinary experiment as we sat at the kitchen table, stealing bites from each other's plates, our fingers grazing in the process. Each touch felt electric, a reminder of how close we now were, of how natural it felt to be near him. There was a carefree ease to the morning. Everything felt light, like we were rediscovering each other with every passing moment. But as the last of the toast was eaten, and we shared a final kiss over a cup of coffee, I couldn't ignore the heat building between us. Every time I tried to get up to do something, clear the dishes, tidy up, the moment I turned around, Daniel would pull me back into his arms, his lips finding mine, soft and lingering at first, then deepening as desire built in the space between us. We moved from the kitchen to the living room, stumbling over our feet, laughter bubbling up as we kissed and touched, the world outside forgotten. Daniel's hands were everywhere, on my waist, in my hair, trailing down the curve of my back as I melted into him. Each kiss felt like an exploration, like we were savoring every inch of each other. I wanted more. I needed more. His lips moved down my neck, soft and insistent, sending shivers through me. The pressure of his body against mine, The feel of his chest rising and falling as his breath grew heavier was intoxicating. But we couldn't stay on the couch forever. I pulled him closer, tugging at his shirt, wanting him to feel the urgency building inside me, wanting to feel him just as badly as he seemed to want me. Before I knew it, we were moving again, this time to the study. Daniel backed me up against the bookshelf, his hands gripping my waist, his lips crashing into mine with a hunger I hadn't realized we both shared until now. I could feel the heat between us, the longing that had been simmering since he walked through the door last night. His kiss was possessive, as though he was making up for lost time, and I welcomed it, threading my fingers through his hair, pulling him closer, urging him to deepen the kiss. The room felt too small, too confining. I needed him. I needed to feel him, all of him. He didn't hesitate. His hands roamed, tracing the curves of my body with a certainty that made my heart race. He lifted me effortlessly, my legs wrapping around his waist as he carried me toward the bedroom. Our lips never broke contact, the taste of him lingering on my tongue, as I kissed him with a fierceness that surprised both of us. When we finally collapsed into the sheets, breathless and laughing, the world outside ceased to exist. There were no more uncertainties, no more doubts. There was only us, tangled together in a mix of soft sheets and warm skin, the lingering taste of each other on our lips. We didn't need to say anything. Our bodies were speaking louder than words ever could. Every touch, every kiss was a promise. A promise that we weren't just together in this moment, but we would be together for everything that came next. The way he touched me, the way his hands caressed every inch of my skin, sent waves of desire crashing through me. I felt like I was coming alive in a way I hadn't before, each kiss an invitation to explore deeper, to give more of ourselves to one another. As we moved, slow at first, savoring every sensation, I realized how much I had missed this. How much I had missed him. This wasn't just about passion. This was about the way he made me feel, seen, wanted, loved. And I reciprocated in every way I knew how. I pulled him closer, grinding against him, my body responding to his touch like it was made for him. We lost ourselves in each other, in the fire we ignited with every soft touch, every whispered word. And when the last wave of passion receded, we were still tangled in each other's arms, hearts racing, breathing heavy, as if we had just crossed a line we hadn't realized existed. But it wasn't just the physical connection that left me breathless. It was the depth of the bond we had created, the shared understanding that, no matter where we went from here, we were in this together. The day slipped away like that, wrapped up in affection, stolen moments, and quiet conversations about the future, our future. We talked about dreams we hadn't shared before, about things we'd been too afraid to say. And through it all, we kept coming back to each other, to the magnetic pull that kept us close, that kept us wanting more. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, we were curled up on the couch, his arms around me, my head resting on his chest. I felt completely at peace, no longer afraid of what came next. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew we'd face them together. And as I listened to the steady beat of his heart beneath my ear, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be. Thank you for hearing this story, for following along through the moments of doubt, the heartache, and the passion. Thank you for allowing me to share the journey of love, how it can be messy, complicated, and uncertain at times, but also how it can be a source of peace, of growth, and of undeniable connection. In the end, love is not a fairy tale or a perfect dream. It's not about always having the right words or knowing exactly what to do at every moment. It's about showing up, choosing each other, even when the road is unclear, even when things seem to fall apart. Love is about finding your way back, even after you've lost sight of what you thought you had. And sometimes it's about simply being there, in the quiet, in the storm, in the chaos, and knowing that the other person will always find their way to you. As I look back on everything, on how far we've come, how much we've changed, how deeply we've loved, I know that this isn't the end. It's just another beginning, a new chapter. And wherever it leads, I'll face it with him by my side, because we've already learned the most important lesson of all. Together, we're unstoppable. So thank you for hearing the story of two people who found their way back to each other and learned that love, in all its forms, is worth the fight. Stay with me and subscribe to the channel.